Authorities have reopened an Ozarks unsolved death of a teenager. 14-year-old Justin Hocutt of Seligman was last seen alive on the morning of October 9th of 1999. About 22 hours later, his body was found on train tracks near his home. Now, the Berry County Sheriff has now asked the Highway Patrol to assist in the investigation. Investigators do not believe the death was an accident, and they have resubmitted evidence for new lab testing.
For nearly 27 years, Justin Hocutt's death was tied to a stretch of railway tracks in Seligman, Missouri. He was 14 years old. The last known account was simple. Justin had been at a neighboring home during the early morning hours, then left on foot. He never made it home. About 22 hours later, his body was found on the tracks near his house, struck by a train. At first, the scene looked like a tragic accident, but something about it didn't add up. Why would a 14-year-old walking home take that route? And what happened to him before he reached those tracks? For years, those questions went unanswered. Then investigators reopened the case. Old interviews were revisited. Evidence that had apparently never been examined by the state laboratory was resubmitted. Witnesses who'd stayed silent for years were interviewed again. In July 2026, nearly 27 years after Justin died, 3 brothers were arrested and charged with his murder: Mark Wesley Scott, Bobby Ray Scott, and David Ray Scott. The arrests didn't come with one dramatic DNA discovery or a single piece of evidence that suddenly solved everything. Investigators said the case had been rebuilt from fragments that survived nearly 3 decades. And at the center of it sat a question that had been there since 1999. What really happened to Justin Hocutt before he reached the railway tracks? Before we go back to 1999, subscribe to Radius of Crime. This channel covers cold cases where old evidence and new witnesses reopen questions people thought would never be answered. Before Justin Hocutt became the subject of a nearly 27-year murder investigation, he was a 14-year-old boy growing up between 2 homes. His aunt, Tammy Tolbert, remembered him as a kid who loved animals, rode his bicycle, went to the movies, spent time with friends, and collected baseball cards. Years later, his family would keep those cards along with his photographs and other belongings, small pieces of a life that ended before he had the chance to grow into it. For several years, Justin had lived with relatives in Pea Ridge, Arkansas, before moving to Seligman, Missouri, where his father and grandparents lived. He'd only been there a short time, settling into a new neighborhood, attending Southwest School, and making friends nearby. According to family reporting, he was also seeing a teenage girl who lived next door. On the morning Justin disappeared, he wasn't at his own home, he was at hers. Sometime between 4 and 5 that morning, according to the probable cause statement filed decades later, someone inside that house discovered Justin and the girl together. But in 1999, the story investigators first heard was much simpler. Justin had been awakened, told to leave, put on his shoes, and walked away. That was supposedly the last anyone saw of him. 22 hours later, he was dead on the railway tracks. If that first account were true, Justin should have made his way back toward his father and grandparents' house. He never arrived. The railway tracks sat across the road and up an embankment, away from the most direct route he would have taken to get home. Why would a boy walking home take that path? At first, investigators treated the railway as the central scene. A train had struck Justin, and the impact had badly disturbed the area, making it difficult to separate injuries caused by the train from anything that may have happened beforehand. But the accident theory got harder to accept. Justin had no alcohol or drugs in his system, and nothing suggested he'd been suicidal. The only thing holding the story together was the account from inside the neighboring home that he'd left alive and on foot. Years later, that account was challenged. According to the probable cause statement, what followed the living room discovery wasn't Justin being sent home. It was an assault. One witness described him being struck and kicked. Another described a rope placed around his neck. Others mentioned objects that may have been used against him, including a stick, a cane, or a baseball bat. The details didn't line up exactly. Nearly 3 decades later, investigators had to determine which witnesses had actually seen something, which had only heard about it, and which details had shifted with time. But the later investigation alleged that Justin may never have walked out of that house under his own power. If he was taken toward the railway after the assault, the tracks stopped being somewhere he wandered to. They became somewhere someone took him. And that left one question. When Justin reached those tracks, was he already dead or still alive when the train arrived? For years, one theory held that Justin had already been killed before he reached the railway, and that the train had simply destroyed the evidence of what happened beforehand. Some former investigators believed the limited blood reportedly found near the impact area suggested Justin had died somewhere else before being placed on the tracks. The later investigation reached a different conclusion. According to the probable cause statement filed against David Scott, the doctor who performed Justin's autopsy determined that Justin was alive when he was placed on the tracks and struck by the train. That distinction changes everything. If Justin was alive when he was placed there, the railway wasn't simply where someone concealed a body after a murder. Placing him on the tracks became part of the act that killed him. There's an important limit to that claim. The complete autopsy report hasn't been publicly released. What the public has is the investigator's summary of the doctor's conclusion, not the full medical analysis. The question of Justin's condition on the tracks was only one problem. Investigators also had to determine what happened inside the neighboring residence and whether the people there had given an accurate account of Justin's departure. The initial version was that Justin had been awakened, told to leave, put on his shoes, and walked out. Later witness accounts alleged that he had been assaulted inside and removed without leaving under his own power. By then, the railway scene had already been disturbed, while the nearby residents had not initially been treated as the clear starting point of a homicide investigation. That meant investigators were trying to reconstruct 2 places at once: the home where Justin was allegedly attacked and the railway where the train struck him. By the time investigators began considering an assault inside the house, the physical evidence was already harder to interpret, and the people who could speak to what happened were connected to the residents themselves. Years later, Sheriff Danny Boyd pointed to a weakness in how some of the original interviews had been handled. Several took place inside the homes of possible suspects. That mattered because questioning witnesses in those surroundings could affect what they were willing to say, particularly if people connected to the case were nearby. The years created another problem. People had died. Memories had changed. Physical evidence had spent years in storage. The case had already been reviewed more than once. Additional interviews were conducted in 2009, 2010, and 2011 after new information surfaced, but none produced a murder case. People appeared to know more than they'd said, yet investigators still lacked enough evidence to establish what happened inside the house and who had taken Justin to the railway. The case remained suspended between suspicion and proof. Then, in 2020, Danny Boyd became sheriff of Barry County, and Justin's case became one of his priorities. Boyd wasn't looking at a fresh crime scene. He was looking at a file already more than 20 years old, with witnesses who were older, some no longer available, and evidence that had to be examined again. The new team went back through the old reports and interviews, revisiting the route between Justin's home, the neighboring residence, and the railway. Some evidence had apparently never reached the state laboratory. So in May 2026, the Barry County Sheriff's Office requested assistance from the Missouri State Highway Patrol's Division of Drug and Crime Control. Evidence was sent to the state crime laboratory for additional examination, but investigators weren't claiming modern science had suddenly solved the case. There was no announced DNA match and no single forensic discovery that explained everything. Instead, they went back to the people. The patrol reported following several credible leads and appealed directly to anyone who might still know something about Justin's final hours. Sergeant Bradley German said investigators believed people still possessed important information about the case. Between February and May 2026, investigators conducted a new round of interviews and compared them with statements taken in 1999. That's when the case started looking different. Not because one person suddenly confessed, not because a piece of DNA solved the mystery, but because details scattered across decades of interviews were beginning to overlap. For the first time, investigators believed they could build a sequence, and that sequence led them back inside the house where Justin was last known to be alive. The renewed investigation didn't produce one perfect witness. It produced pieces. Some came from people who said they'd seen what happened inside the house. Others said they'd heard it. Others described conversations that happened afterward. One witness described seeing Justin surrounded during an assault. Another recalled sounds suggesting a fight inside the residence. The specific details didn't always match. Some mentioned a stick, others a cane, a baseball bat, or a cast iron skillet. Investigators weren't trying to create one perfectly consistent story. They were looking for details that held up across separate accounts despite the passage of time. One of the most disturbing allegations involved what happened after the assault. The probable cause statement describes a rope placed around Justin's neck, along with statements about taking him to the railway. Bleach became another detail worth comparing. One witness said several gallons had been purchased around the time of Justin's death. Years earlier, former detective Brian Martin had described a vacant apartment in the complex that smelled strongly of bleach and reacted to luminol testing. But Martin also acknowledged that bleach itself can cause a luminol reaction. The smell and test result therefore raised suspicion without proving that blood had been cleaned from the apartment. Investigators also gathered statements about what people allegedly said after Justin's death. Some involved alleged admissions by members of the Scott family. Others concerned conversations between Harold Johnson and Brenda Scott. Again, investigators had to separate first-hand accounts from hearsay. Former Detective Brian Martin was revisited as well. According to the filing, he described what one witness had reported during the original investigation, giving investigators a way to compare that account with what was being said nearly 27 years later. Slowly, investigators believed the separate accounts pointed toward the same basic sequence. Justin was confronted inside the residence, assaulted, badly injured, and then taken toward the railway. The witnesses didn't agree on every object or every detail, but investigators believed enough of the accounts supported one another to move the case beyond suspicion. The story was no longer simply that Justin walked away. It was becoming that Justin may have been taken. By the summer of 2026, investigators believed they had enough to seek arrest warrants. The three men were brothers, Mark Wesley Scott, Bobby Ray Scott, and David Ray Scott. All three were charged with first-degree murder, but the publicly available evidence did not describe their alleged roles in exactly the same way. The most detailed allegations came in the probable cause statement against David Scott. Investigators accused David of taking part in the assault, beating, stomping, or striking Justin with an object, and then helping coordinate moving him toward the railway once he became incapacitated or unresponsive. If prosecutors pursue that account, they'll have to establish what David did, what he knew, and how his actions contributed to Justin's death. For Mark and Bobby, the publicly available information is less specific. Although both face the same charge, the source material does not describe their individual conduct in the same detail. A shared connection to the house does not automatically establish the same conduct by everyone inside it. By July 2026, Mark and Bobby Scott had been arrested in Arkansas, while David Scott was arrested in McDonald County, Missouri. David was later transferred to the Berry County Jail and booked on July 23rd under a first-degree murder charge. But an arrest isn't a conviction. The warrants establish probable cause, not guilt. The state will still have to identify the role it attributes to each brother and prove those allegations beyond a reasonable doubt. The reliability of the witnesses will be central because some accounts date from 1999 while others emerged nearly 27 years later. Those questions will have to be answered in court. For nearly 27 years, Justin's family had no courtroom answer to the question that had followed them since 1999. They had his photographs, his belongings, his school memories, and the baseball cards he'd collected as a 14-year-old. What they didn't have was an explanation. His aunts, Paula Roney and Tammy Tolbert, kept his memory alive through years of silence. They heard rumors and received messages from people claiming to know what had happened, but some accounts could not be verified and others contradicted one another. Then the years passed. 20, 25, nearly 27. Justin stayed 14 in their memories. He never got older, never finished school, never added another baseball card to his collection, never got the chance to become the person his family expected him to become. Then, in July 2026, 3 men were arrested. For Justin's family, that brought something they hadn't had since 1999, not certainty. Not justice yet, but movement. Tammy Tolbert said the family had wondered whether anyone would ever be held accountable. After nearly 3 decades, investigators were finally putting the allegations in front of a court. After nearly 27 years, Justin Hocutt's case has reached a point his family once feared they might never see. 3 men have been charged with his murder, but the charges are only the beginning. The court will have to determine what happened inside that house, who took part, and how Justin ended up on the railway. It will have to weigh witnesses whose memories stretch back nearly 3 decades, some describing what they saw firsthand and others repeating what they were told. It will also have to hear the basis for the claim that Justin was alive when he reached the tracks, since the complete autopsy report has not been publicly released. Mark Scott, Bobby Scott, and David Scott have been charged. They have not been convicted. The state still has to prove its case against each of them beyond a reasonable doubt. The motive has not been publicly established, and the investigation remains active. Additional charges or arrests are possible. For Justin's family, however, the arrests brought relief after nearly 27 years of uncertainty. His aunt, Tammy Tolbert, said the family had wondered whether anyone would ever be held accountable. The charges do not restore the life Justin lost, and they do not decide the question of guilt. They create a place where the evidence can finally be tested. A courtroom may now determine what happened before Justin reached the tracks. Justin Hocutt was 14 years old. His family never got to watch him grow older. After nearly 27 years, they may finally get the chance to hear what happened to him. For Radius of Crime, this is the story of Justin Hocutt, a boy whose death was once treated as a railway tragedy and whose case, decades later, became a murder investigation. If you want more stories where old evidence, forgotten witnesses, and renewed investigations bring cold cases back into the light, subscribe to Radius of Crime.